One of the things that we need to talk about, March is the month that in the United States we celebrate women in general. March 8th, in fact, all over the planet, we celebrate International Women's Day. But then we have to ask ourselves, what are we really celebrating? Because there is a lot of violence against our women and our daughters. In the future, we're going to have a whole conversation about violence against men and boys. But today, we're going to have a conversation about violence against women. And the reason we're having this conversation today is because it relates to the level of violence that we are seeing in our communities. Now, the data that I'm going to share here comes specifically in regards to Mexico, but it is essential that we recognize that there are a lot of similarities between Mexico and the violence against women and the United States. In their life, a lot of individuals don't understand, but there's so much data here. And among Mexican women, and for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to refer to women starting in the age of 15 and on. The research says that in their lifetime, women will experience more violence in Mexico when they are in the community. So, one out of every two of the women who are victims experience violence when they are out there in the community. And the second place where they tend to be victimized, and by violence in this situation, we're talking about emotional, psychological type of violence, physical violence, and sexual violence. The second place or the second group is violence from their partner. And again, one of the things that we often don't talk about in this country of the United States is how often our girls begin dating and experience dating violence, where he will demand pictures that she doesn't want to take or send, where he will treat her inappropriately, will yell, will scream, will say, if you don't do this, I'm not going to love you anymore. And we have to remember that many of us are the product of trauma. And in the words of Dr. Maria Hess, who was a wonderful professor in psychology, psychotherapist, friend, colleague, mentor, she always would say, trauma is the gift that keeps on giving. And if we don't focus on healing, we often end up either passing the trauma to other people, or, and this is important, we allow the trauma to happen to somebody else. Often in relationships, we tolerate this type of trauma, especially when it's a partner situation. Well, if you don't want to deal with him, let's say, just move out. And instead of being supportive of the victim, we basically blame them for the experience they're going through. Lately in Sonoma County, we've seen more of the trauma against females in schools. We're hearing about a young individual who was victimized in Pioneer High School, multiple victims in Santa Rosa High School, victims in different locations. The research says that this is the third place where most of these young individuals will experience violence. And then the last place where many of them will experience violence is at work. And it is important for us to understand that in the school system, is where most of the individuals, females 15 years or older, will experience violence. 1 in 5 females between the ages of 15 and older, 1 in 5 will experience some form of violence in their lifetime. And again, this could be bullying, psychological violence. This could be physical violence, somebody punches them or kicks them or whatever. And then there is sexual violence, which often we prefer to not speak about, and it becomes the elephant in the room. And we think that by not talking about it, everything will be fine. We need to understand that, according to the research, almost 1 out of every 10 girls between the ages of 15 and older will experience sexual violence in a school setting. And this, of course, and we'll talk more about this later, but this, of course, becomes problematic when you have a COVID situation and we all stay home. But we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. When we talk about who the aggressors are of these 15-year-olds or older in the school setting, we're talking about a classmate, then a teacher. So a male classmate, a male teacher, a female classmate, and then another individual from the same school, but that the victim doesn't know, and then other individuals who may be on campus, then the female teacher, and then somebody who works in school, a principal, and a worker in school who happens to be female. And again, in the future, we're going to talk about the victimization of boys because is often where research is not done. But also, as a society, when we do this type of research, boys tend to not be honest about being victims because it's a major trigger. And we have taught boys to never speak about victimization, to never speak about trauma, to never show emotion, and so on. So I also want to point out here that in the research, girls are victimized not just by males, but by females as well. In Mexico, of the 50.5 million females 15 years old or older, 79% have worked at least one time in their uh, lifetimes outside of the home. In the last 5 years, 60% of them have worked outside the home, and 50% work outside the home in the last 12 months. And this is important because, again, the numbers of people who are victimized. And typically, when they are in a work setting, the number one abuser in the situation is a male or female coworker. And then the owner of the business, male or female, right? They use intimidation that this individual may lose their job. And again, when we talk about violence, it's not always just sexual, but we're talking about mental, emotional, and physical. And then the third group is the client who's receiving services, and then a direct supervisor. And then there's other individuals. And the reason why we're even having this conversation is because, again, as a society, we act like this is not a problem, but it is problematic. Dr. Maria Hess also used to say the number one way to heal from violence is, or trauma, I should say, is speaking about that. She, in fact, used to come here to KBBF and speak with us about trauma. And I will remember always that she would say that. She would say, the best way to heal is to speak about it. Okay. So it's important. And again, if any of this information is triggering, remember 988 is the suicide prevention hotline. And then there's other resources that might be available in your specific community. But it is important that we have these conversations because if we don't, then victimization continues. Having conversations with your children are essential. And it's interesting when we provide data about female victims, how often they get blamed for being the victim, but two, how often people blame them by saying, well, why was she there? Why was she dating him? Instead of saying, hey, your boy should not be doing this. And how do we teach boys to be respectful of girls? Right? Those are not the conversations, or those are not the conversations that are happening, but should be happening. Another way of taking advantage of women, again, 15 years old or older, in employment is that they often, their opportunities are for advancement are limited, or they get paid less. And we know the statistics in the United States, they're really horrible, right? For every dollar that a white male makes, a white female makes about 75 to 78 cents on the dollar. An African American female makes on average about 66 to 68 cents on the dollar. And a Latinx makes between 58 cents to 63 cents on the dollar, right? So sometimes they just are not giving a better job. Sometimes they pay them less. Sometimes in some places, like in Mexico, often if they get pregnant, often they lose their jobs. If that happens here, make sure you reach out for support because that is technically illegal. And again, when we talk about specifically sexual assaults, most of the victims will experience sexual assault. One out of every two victims of sexual assault will experience that assault when they are out there in the community. And often, again, when they are out there in the community, these individuals will experience this type of violence um, from somebody who they don't know. And then the second group is somebody that they actually know, and it could be somebody they are dating or friend of the family, then a neighbor or a friend, right? And then there are other individuals, including priests and other religious figures. And a lot of this violence actually takes place among 15-year-olds and older in the street, at the park, sometimes in the bus, at a store, at a plaza, at a commercial, center where you go buy your groceries. And then it happens at somebody's home. And so it's really, really important that we understand this. And the research suggests that most of the violence that in the last couple of years women have experienced has been psychological, followed by some form of economic violence. Again, not being able to get a better position at a job, or being discriminated, lower pay, getting fired, all of those things. Physical violence is the next one, and then sexual violence. Let us also remember that a lot of people who have been the victims of sexual violence specifically are often not reporting this, so that data may be off. And when we talk about violence in general, again, emotional, physical, or sexual, specifically, when we combine it all, the research suggests that a sibling, brother, sister, is the number one person that is victimizing, followed by dad, followed by mom, another family member, an uncle, an aunt, a cousin, so on and so forth, which is a little bit different than actual sexual violence, where the research suggests that at least in Mexico, excuse me, is typically the uncle or the aunt, the cousin, and then we move over to brother, sister, dad, and other individuals. And again, we need to speak up. And the reason I bring that last piece is because we know that during the pandemic, and the research is finally coming out in the United States, during the pandemic, many children who used to go to school to feel safe didn't have their teachers, didn't have their friends, didn't have a safe space to go to. And here on KBBF, I used to announce almost every other week, I would remind people when the pandemic was really strong. We used to remind people if your neighbors have children and they don't come out for walks, and if they have a backyard, you don't hear them laughing and having fun, then you should call the police, you should call social services because something is wrong. A lot of those children that wouldn't come out during those periods of time, I mean, children don't like to be cooped up in these places and just kept indoors all the time. And so the fact that they don't come out creates a lot of suspicion. And now what we have, based on the research, is a lot of children who are back in school, but they have a lot of trauma from physical, emotional, and sexual trauma that as a result now is finally coming out in aggressive manners in school. It is important for us to see again that in many of our local schools, children are experiencing direct trauma in a physical form, in an emotional form, or again, it could potentially be in a sexual way. And so, Líderes del Futuro began last night a new survey for middle school and high school children in Sonoma County. And the survey is about safety. Do you feel safe at school? Do you feel that administrators are doing enough to keep you safe? Right? And other questions are involved there. And the last couple of questions invite individuals to just give us feedback. What is it that they should get a support from the school to be able to be safe? And then the last question is about the community in general. What can your community do to make sure that you feel safe in general? This week, we had students from Montgomery High School, Maria Carrillo High School, other high schools yesterday who came out, protested, and they have their demands. And this way, we're inviting them to tell us what they need, because blaming doesn't get things done. If somebody blames somebody else, what happens is the other person gets defensive and there's no dialogue. So Líderes del Futuro Avanzando is trying to gather the data and present it to school districts and say, for your school, this is what the kids are saying. And again, the identifiers for the children are not going to be shared, just the data. We'll probably bring it back here to KBBF. We'll share it in our YouTube channel. We'll share it in our podcast. And for sure, we'll share it with all of the districts from which students participate. Middle school and high school students is the focus for today. And again, it's not just females for that research. We want everybody of those children, male, females, non-gender conforming, to participate and to tell us what is happening and how can we support them. Yesterday was March 8th, International Women's Day. It's a day when we are supposed to celebrate. It's a day when we are supposed to feel good about the fact that we live in a society where women don't have to worry. I was telling my students yesterday in my class, I don't know what it feels like to be a female, but I do know that when I walk around campus sometimes, I see females, right, who are very cautious about individuals, especially male. And it must be a difficult form of existing. During COVID, many individuals, children, females, and males, and non gender conforming, experience violence or witness violence. Children witness alcoholism among their parents and other drug use, and sometimes began using alcohol or other drugs as a coping mechanism. Children were the victims of emotional abuse, physical abuse, and some of them, sadly, sexual abuse. And now that they are back in society, they are having difficulty participating in society's activities in school and outside the school. Many children now, if they have a cell phone, they live in their cell phone. While walking around Santa Rosa Junior College on a daily basis, I see a large number of our community that is just in their cell phones. I've seen several individuals, students who almost crash into each other because they're afraid, they're uncomfortable to make eye contact with anybody. They're uncomfortable to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening. They do not participate in discussions in the classroom. And sometimes they just simply don't show up to class at all. Unless we have this type of conversations, we are going to continue having violence. We're going to continue having victims, and we are going to continue suffering as a society. And a reminder that children are not likely to report certain types of abuse due to fear of retaliation from family or whomever the aggressor is. We must speak openly about this in order to be able to create a certain level of comfort or okay with speaking about it by them feeling comfortable then to say, hey, this is what I'm dealing with. And then we have to provide resources in places like schools and the community in general. Humanidad Therapy and Education Services, for example, after the situation that took place at Montgomery High School recently of violence, Humanidad Therapy and Education Services spent a couple of days there providing services. We need to do this all the time. Kids ultimately want to talk about their traumas, their fears, their concerns, but only if provided with the healthy space that says you belong. And as a reminder, 988 is the suicide prevention hotline. You can text, you can call. Feel free to share that information with children, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a parent, whether you're a caretaker, whatever the situation may be, you may save a life. Let's all heal together.